This video is a complete summary of all canon subject matter towards the series in question. It contains spoilers and details for numerous aspects to the story and its events, and is not meant to serve as a replacement to experiencing any of the pieces of media mentioned. Please support the official releases of the developers and their entries in the franchise. Throughout the 1980s, Japan's RPG scene was defined by three major players: Square, Enix, and Nihon Falcom. While the former two went on to internationally shape RPGs for the next few decades, Nihon Falcom remained an underdog in Japan and a firm niche company globally, but they do have their fan base. Throughout the 80s and onwards, Falcom was most known for their turn-based RPG series Dragon Slayer, later becoming The Legend of Heroes, and their action RPG series, Ys, both pioneers in their respective genres. Some other small series have come about, including Brandish and Xanadu, but the former two are by far the most prominent and prolific series in Falcom's catalog. Today, The Legend of Heroes has been riding high thanks to the acclaim and sales globally from the recent Trails sub-series. This includes Trails in the Sky, Cold Steel, as well as some of the Japanese exclusive releases. But instead today we'll be discussing a series that is a personal favorite of mine, one that I want to give the closer look it deserves. While Ys was most influential and popular back in the late 80s and early 90s when it was first released, it's remained prolific ever since, with new entries, remakes, and spin-offs releasing to this day. On Complete Chronologies, I want to look for franchises, preferably that I'm familiar with, that have extraordinary worlds and lore that don't receive proper recognition, most of the time because they haven't broken out into mainstream popularity, at least at the time. For me personally, I feel like Ys easily fits that description. Some might wonder why I'm not choosing the other notable Falcom series, and while yes, that series is extremely more noteworthy for its world building and story, I'm not as familiar with it yet. And recently I felt like Ys has fallen more into obscurity and could use a bit of a boost wherever it can. The series began as Ys 1, Ancient Ys Vanished, an early PC title in the PC 8801 in 1987, with its immediate sequel coming a year later. Both were considered killer apps in Japan for the system, and both were considered a killer app as well when they were ported as Ys Book 1 and 2 globally for the TurboGrafx CD. The original Ys games were innovative in their gameplay, their sound, and their stories that all came bundled together to make a truly unforgettable experience. Whenever I begin an Ys game, I know that I'm in for a fleshed-out ARPG created by a passionate group of developers, and I wanted to do it justice by tapping into the surprisingly rich lore that has lasted for decades at this point, and is still going strong. If you're just looking at a list of all the entries in the Ys series, it can be a bit hard to decipher what's canon and what's not. Not to mention the order these occur in, because it's not always obvious. So before we begin proper, let's give a quick rundown of the entries that will be covered in this lore retelling. It's a bit hard to just list what entries are canon without giving a brief summary of the history of this franchise, though. The aforementioned Ys Book 1 and 2 were released on Japanese computers in 1987 and 1988 respectively. They were released on American DOS and Sega Master System a couple years later. While these two have received their fair share of remakes, it's always been as a collection of the two of them, Ys Book 1 and 2, and it makes sense, they truly feel like companion pieces when you play them. Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys, was released in 1989 for PC 8801 and globally for TurboGrafx CD and SNES. Following this comparatively simplistic trilogy, a few years later there were two releases that went under the name of Ys 4. Ys 4 Mask of the Sun was developed by Tonkin House for Super Famicom, and Ys 4 The Dawn of Ys for PC Engine, neither of which were released stateside at the time. They feature retellings of a similar story, but as we'll come to see later, neither of which is canon. Nihon Falcom returned to develop Ys 5 in 1995 for Super Famicom. Ys 6, The Arc of Napishtim, was released for PC and PS2 in 2003. A prequel, Ys Origin, was released for Windows in 2006. Ys 7 was released for PSP in 2009, and Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana, was released in 2016 for Vita, with ports to come for PS4, Windows, and Switch. Now you might think that overall this is fairly straightforward, all things considered, but oh, we haven't even gotten started yet. So let's talk remakes. Falcom is known for trying to make their series available on as many platforms as possible for them, if they can globally, and while that's awesome, it can be a bit hard to decipher what's canon. The main rule of thumb is that the most recent release of a title, or book of at-all, is the canon one. So let's start once again from the beginning. Ys 1 and 2, as stated before, have always been re-released as a pair. This included in Ys Book 1 and 2 on TurboGrafx CD, as well as various other ports on Windows, DS, PS2, PSP, and modern PCs. Currently, Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles Plus on Steam is the most canon version of 1 and 2. Ys 3 had plenty of ports when it was released, but it's actually been remade from the ground up as Ys the Oath in Felghana, a remake originally released for PSP and later Windows that serves as the canonical replacement for Wanderers of Ys. Similarly, both versions of Ys 4 were rendered non-canon because of the remake Ys Memories of Celceta, which serves as the canon replacement. Some Falcom employees have said this is merely another retelling of those events, but seeing the pattern we have with this series, the chaotic nature of Ys 4's releases, and the fact that this is the only one released globally and developed by Nihon Falcom, I don't think I'm angering too many people to say this is the canon entry. Now Ys 5, which is a bit of the odd one out here in the series. It's unfortunately the oldest game in the series not to receive a modern remake, and it's not quite new enough to be on relevant hardware. It was on Super Famicom, and later Arc System Works, of all people, made a soft remake for PS2. However, it doesn't really matter because neither were released outside of Japan. So this is the only entry in the main Ys series unplayable to us Westerners. We will just be considering the original SNES version for canon purposes. Everything else in the series mostly uses their up-to-date release. There's Ys 9 Monstrum Nox, which has been released in Japan in 2019, just came out on PS4 in early February of this year, and will get releases on Windows and Nintendo Switch later on in 2021. I haven't spoiled myself, but I do know that this takes place at the end of the timeline, and I don't want to spoil everyone else, so I will likely just add an addendum featuring content from Monstrum Nox, probably towards the end of the year. And hopefully you can treat this series as a decent primer to get you up to date before you finally jump into Ys 9. Nearly all of the canon media is contained within this main series of games though. There were some spin-offs that have been confirmed to be non-canon. Ys Strategy is an RTS spin-off. Ys vs. Sora no Kiseki Alternative Saga was a crossover fighting game between Ys and fellow Falcom franchise Trails in the Sky. Ys Dragons of Altago is a sort of multiplayer alternative to Ys 7 available on mobile. And finally, Ys Online Call of Solemn, which was canon for a bit, taking place 100 years after the main story, but it was discontinued and had a limited release anyway. Most have called it non-canon as of recently, though I suppose it doesn't contradict much if you have a soft spot for it. There was also an anime adaptation back in the 90s of the original Ys Books 1 and 2, and while they are officially non-canon, seeing as how certain events from it are accurate representations of canon events, I might be using some footage later on in the series, as I do think it looks rather nice. So with all that out of the way, let's get things started. Similar to previous Complete Chronologies videos, the bar at the top will show the in-universe time, the source of information, and the time in relation to the games. In this entry, I will be using the same timescale as certain community sources in terms of a fixed origin year. This method puts year 0 in Ys as the year when series protagonist Adol Kristen is born. I think this makes things fairly easy to understand and puts things in a common perspective. It also allows for the very punny before Kristen and after Kristen times. Also, I feel like it's worth mentioning that there's plenty of information within this franchise that is deliberately left up to player interpretation, especially within the backstory of this universe. I'll do my best to fill in blanks thanks to the fantastic resources that I was able to utilize during my research, and I won't infer too much if it starts going into super subjective territory. However, I definitely feel like there's enough cohesion between factual events to provide an engaging narrative. Now, without further ado, let's begin our journey through the universe of Ys. In the beginning, Earth was nothing more than a vast ocean, with life owing themselves to the all-powerful gods. The god of the sky, Horu, would create a boundless sky expanse, spreading in all directions. Later, the god of the sea, Grithaios, conjured a downpour, giving rise to the oceans of the world. This world was very similar in size to our Earth, with the main difference being the existence of 2 moons in the sky. The world was mostly just a vast ocean. Eventually, various sea creatures began to develop as the first life on the planet. Later, the first sentient species became the dominant race on Earth, a naturally sea-dwelling species of the water. At this time, the third god of the planet began to reveal herself. Maya, the goddess of Earth, created the planet's landmasses as well as the Great Tree of Origins, a manifestation of her will. While most of the planet was still ocean, she invited the species of sea creatures to come live on land as well, to become the dominant species of both Earth and sea. They accepted, and the amphibious creatures lived as one with the planet, for what became known as the Ocean Era. This era likely lasted for millions of years before the true purpose of the Great Tree of Origins revealed itself. In order to sustain the world's existence, the Great Tree facilitates an evolution cycle, wherein periodically during the world's lifespan the tree creates a unique cataclysmic event, one that destroys the current dominant species and radically changes the environment of the Earth. This cataclysm was known as the Lacrimosa. A new species, one that could survive both the Lacrimosa and environment changes, would receive the blessings of evolution from the tree and become the new dominant species of Earth. This created a selection and rejection process for the tree to carry out at the end of every major era. The sea creatures learned of the approaching Lacrimosa and the true purpose of the Great Tree of Origins. In response, one member of the race, Hydra, attempted to lead his people in an attempt to stop the Lacrimosa. Though this would be challenging, the Great Tree of Origins had become so intertwined with the Earth itself that it needed to exist for the world to survive, and the Lacrimosa was Maya's will, which the Great Tree was created to carry out. Hydra was clever, and thought of the idea to counteract the tree's mystical energy with their own. Near the Great Tree, Hydra constructed the Seren Garden, which houses the Tree of Psyches. This tree had the ability to collect the mystical energy of current evolutionary species in an effort to dispel the energy of the Lacrimosa. But the psyches of the marine creatures was not enough to stop the Tree of Origins cataclysm. The Lacrimosa was carried out, causing storms and blizzards to rage across the globe. Temperatures dropped and the world became mostly frozen, killing off the dominant marine life. However, this was not the end for Hydra himself. He was selected by the Great Tree to become a Warden of Evolution. Being a Warden can be considered an honor and a curse. Every Lacrimosa, a single member of the doomed race with a bright and pure soul, is selected to become a Warden. They are granted the gift of eternal life, and are chosen to watch over the new worlds created by Lacrimosas, and provide proof of their race's existence. They are brandished with a marking to prove their status. Over time, Hydra grew to accept both his role as a warden and the Lacrimosa itself. He believed that fighting it would be futile, and that it was necessary for the world to continue. The cycle of evolution continued. During this new frozen era, a race of larger, furred creatures were able to prosper and survive in the harsh climate. Civilization thrived until eventually, presumably, millions of years later, a new Lacrimosa began, and would gradually wipe out this species as well. While details are unknown, it resulted in another climate shift. The Earth grew more tropical, and caused the current dominant species to die off. The stern king of the species, Minos, was chosen by the Great Tree to be the next warden of evolution, and joined Hydra. In this tropical climate, a race of large sentient insectoids prospered and became the dominant species. It's known that this was the first time a large sentient species had a population of over 1 million. They were led by Nestor, a firm but benevolent queen. As expected, eventually the Lacrimosa would come for this species as well. This appeared to make the surface near uninhabitable to most, and as such, the successors took to the skies. Nestor was selected as the latest warden of evolution. Very little is known about the true appearance of the beings of the Sky Era. This is because their race possessed the ability of impeccable mimicry. They make themselves appear like any other race, or a specific member of that race with accuracy. The great cataclysm that caused the end of the Sky Era is probably the most unknown, as it isn't clear what both killed the race of airborne beings and led the way to a return to a more modest tropical climate, but both did occur. The Warden of Evolution for the Sky Era was a woman named Ura. The penultimate era of evolution was known as the Eternian Era. This was an age of reptilians, large and small, ruled by creatures called saurians. This era is heavily analogous to the age of dinosaurs on our Earth. Similar to how humans evolved from primate species such as apes, a species called the Eternians evolved from these saurians. Eternians became the dominant species during this era. Appearance-wise, they looked very similar to humans, with the main difference being their larger stature, and on average more muscular physique. Women on average were around 6.5 feet, while men were around 7.5. The Eternian capital was the city of Aegeus, located on the island of Seiren, the same island the Great Tree of Origins was located on. The society developed a religion revolving around the Great Tree, which granted the people mystical foresight and guidance. Thus, the two most important people in the Eternian kingdom were their king or queen, and the Maiden of the Great Tree, who was chosen to receive the premonitions offered by the Great Tree. The first maiden, Io, was originally a member of a group of bandits. When about to kill a traveling man, she was moved by the man's calming words. She decided to turn her life around and follow this man, who was in actuality the Saint of Salvation, Uranus, a peaceful healing sage. When the saint died, a continuous downpour fell upon Eternia. Io prayed to the Great Tree for the rain to stop, and the wish was granted. She would go on to make the Temple of the Great Tree, where she received her premonitions. The current king gave Io his blessing and decreed the temple to be of equal importance to the royal palace, and thus the tradition of the Maiden of the Great Tree was born. The Eternians continued to flourish for centuries, perhaps millennia. During a period of relative peace for the Eternians, the new Maiden of the Great Tree is being decided. Among them includes 3 candidates, Dana, Sarai, and Olga, who have been friends since childhood. Olga is a strong warrior who is tough on both herself and others. Olga is considered the favorite to be named the Maiden. Sarai was a sickly child growing up. Unbeknownst to her peers, she actually succumbed to her illness. Ura, the Warden of Evolution, who sensed that the next Lacrimosa was approaching, used this opportunity to mimic herself to pose as Sarai, allowing her to find candidates who could be the next Warden of Evolution for the Eternians. Finally, Dana, who from a young age was noticeably proficient in using essence, which is what allows for the ability of premonitions, though this power frightened her growing up. She lost her mother in a house fire, and blames herself, as if she accepted her power sooner, she may have been able to save her. This tragedy motivates her to accept her abilities and desires to harness them to prevent other events. Donna is a troublesome youth, sneaking into places she shouldn't, breaking things, and causing trouble, but she has a kind heart. Later, Donna receives what's called a Scarlet Vision, a vision of an immediate future that cannot be prevented. The vision depicts a forest fire, and while the fire itself can't be prevented, she wants to allow for only minimal damage, and thus sets out to destroy the walls of the Aegean Reservoir to put out the flames. Donna was scolded due to the flooding that destroyed the Eternian Sanctuary, but later, after further research and analysis, this was deemed necessary, as the fire could have posed a threat to the tree and the temple. Retrospectively, Donna's actions were met favorably and proved her decisiveness. Through actions like this, Donna is later selected to be the next maiden of the Great Tree. Donna becomes the maiden during a ceremony called the Arboreal Awakening. 3 years later, Queen Elaine summons Donna and her guardian Olga to Aegeus as she is about to retire and abdicate the throne to her daughter. To their surprise, her daughter is the woman they believed to be Sarai, who had held her royal lineage as a secret. Some time passes, with Donna as the maiden, Sarai as queen, and Olga as a royal guard. Donna starts receiving visions in her dream of a swordsman with fiery red hair arrive in Eternia. However, when he reaches Aegeus, he finds it ruined and abandoned from a cliff overlooking it. Olga and Donna head to the spot where the swordsman was, and Donna feels compelled to plant a prayer tree sapling. Donna continues to track the mysterious boy's movements in her prevalent dreams, eventually leading her to an Eternian sanctuary crypt, where she meets up with Io, a mysterious girl who is also present during her arboreal awakening. Surprisingly, Io seems to know quite a bit about this crypt, though she eventually arrives at a seemingly dead end and returns. In another vision with the swordsman, Donna strangely sees herself amongst the swordsman and his companions. They wished to enter the spiritual Baja Tower, but it was blocked by a rock formation. She heads to the tower and encounters new abilities, but when she arrives, she doesn't see anything resembling an obtrusive rock wall, but plants a prayer tree sapling anyway. With her new abilities, she makes her way deeper into the sanctuary and learns more about the history of Eternia. Donna becomes disturbed when she sees through her visions of the swordsman a large sinkhole in place of where the palace should be. Olga tries to assure Donna that these are just illusions, and Eternia will continue to be prosperous. Donna plants another sapling at the palace, and travels deeper into the crypt. Later, Donna has a scarlet vision, one where she sees what appears to be a star falling from the sky, one that appears to be making impact over Aegeus. After consulting with Olga and Sarai, they decide to have all able channelers use essence to project a barrier over the Aegean capital. They are able to successfully prepare, and true to Donna's word, a meteor plummets to the capital, but is stopped by the barrier. Unfortunately, this was only the first strike of a constant bombardment. More and more meteors start to crash into the barrier, causing it to crack and take damage. Eventually, Donna and Olga are rushing to try and assist. However, finally, a large meteor shatters the barrier of Aegeus, destroying the capital. Immediately after, Donna feels a burn on her arm, and a red sigil appears, the symbol of the Warden of Evolution. A cloaked Ura arrives and tells Donna to head to the Valley of Kings to learn of the purpose of the sigil. Queen Sarai, secretly Ura, had disappeared as the aftermath of the meteor sent the people into disarray. Many citizens blamed Donna, suggesting the meteors were witchcraft called by the maiden. Donna heads into the sanctuary crypt one final time, where she once again meets Io, who reveals the first maiden whom she has learned through records in the crypt, and Io are one and the same. Io tells her that she has kept her soul tied to Aegeus all this time to inform future maidens of the Great Tree's purpose and the Lachrymosas, without the wardens noticing. After receiving Io's warning, she heads to the Valley of Kings. In the valley, Donna meets the other Wardens of Evolution. She learns how she was chosen to be the next one, and how the Lacrimosa was already starting to take place. She refuses her role, and attempts to add her people's energy to the Tree of Psyches, as the other Wardens explained that they had all attempted the same and failed. Meanwhile, her people were dying. After the initial casualties of the meteors across the world, the weather started changing. Thick clouds covered the atmosphere, and snow was constant. The cold-blooded Eternians couldn't survive. Olga had already perished, protecting the survivors, and Donna was now truly alone. Still, though, she refused the position of Warden and made the decision to help those of the next race who could potentially stop the Lacrimosa. She sealed herself in the Great Tree, where she would be undisturbed, as the sigil of the Wardens kept her now immortal body alive for millions of years. These changes left behind a world for mammals to thrive, and an earth of humans began to follow. As an aside, it will become easy to see that the Earth of this universe is deliberately a parallel to the real world. Many locations and even certain events have real-world equivalents, with the precise correspondence almost always being obvious, as will become apparent when locations start to be introduced. Life evolved in a mammalian-dominated society, similarly to how we have observed a post-Cretaceous Earth. The first record of sentient life occurred on the continent of Africa, namely in the northern region of Altago. Humans began to populate and flourish in this fertile land. They worshipped and were held in balance by 5 dragon deities. The origin of these dragons is unknown, as they have existed throughout recorded human history. Seeing as how entwined they are with humanity and humanity's presence on this world, it's likely that they weren't in existence before humans became the dominant species, though any more reasoning would be speculation. These 5 dragons watched over the land of Altago, which served as a nexus point for humanity. Radamanj, the Earth Dragon. Angu Baral, the Flame Dragon. Mu Anti, the Wind Dragon. O Balon, the Sea Dragon. And Z Kalios, the Moon Dragon. If the balance between these forces is upset, then the eldris of a tribe called the Iska can begin a ritual known as the Wind of Destruction. By sacrificing enough living souls of Altago to an altar called the Well of Souls, the well will open and bring forth the root of all existence. The root is a being with the ability to end the existence of all life on the planet. Unlike the Lacrimosa, though, this doesn't alter the Earth to allow for a new web of life and dominant species to flourish. The acts of the root act like a hard reset, wiping the slate clean and recreating the current dominant species along with other life, while keeping the dragons, the Well of Souls, and presumably the land masses that existed previously. This allows humanity to try again, this time hopefully maintaining the balance of the draconic elements. The 5 dragons are able to retaliate against the ritual and protect the people by summoning a dragon warrior who can attempt to stop the root of all existence. It is implied that the extinction and rebirth cycle caused by the Wind of Destruction and root of all existence has happened several times already for humanity. For now, though, Altago is at peace and balanced. Later on, life would begin thriving on the continent to the north of Africa, Arisia, including the land known as Europa. Sentient life would also begin to spring up westward, across the Atlas Ocean, in the ocean's namesake, the continent of Atlas. These were populated by humans, along with another group of mammals known as the Reda, with long pointed ears and tails. After centuries of living on the Atlas continent, a mineral known as Emel was discovered. It was a green, translucent material that was actually harder than steel. The humans who lived in the area where Emel was prominent kept it a secret, to protect their homes from poachers or devious power seekers. They learned how to refine Emel into a metal known as Emelas. Emel could be transmuted into red, blue, and gold Emelas. Not only were they the strongest metal known at the time, but it was discovered that these metals held power that could control fire, wind, and lightning respectively. With the power of Emelas, this sect of humans began to flourish and created a kingdom. This society of humans became known as the Eldeen. Through their technology and experimentation, they were able to transmute and isolate 2 more kinds of Emelas that were exceedingly rare and hard to craft. The first of which was Black Emelas, which contained the immense power of all 3 previous types of the metal combined, as well as amplifying its own power to a great degree depending on the amount of the metal. Using it on its own, however, is dangerous. It's easy for it to become unstable and release dark essence in the form of demons if used by a weak force. This is why it should only be handled by items of the other rare metal, White Emelas. This rare Emelas was malleable, manipulable, and as physically strong as any other form of Emel. It held plenty of magical power on its own, though not as much as its other rare counterpart. It can, however, insulate the powers of Black Emelas, and using tools of White Emelas, the powers of the dark metal could be used to its full effect, with little harm. Over time, the Eldeen took this a step further. They developed the means to use magic to transfer their souls out of their bodies into something previously inanimate. This would lead them to construct life-sized versions of themselves made of White Emelas, and then transfer their souls into these bodies. These bodies were strong, immortal, had wings crafted onto them, and could use Black Emelas without any limitations. Their wings would earn them the fitting nickname of the Winged Ones to other members of the Atlas continents. Because of their appearance and immortal life, other humans, as well as the Reda, would begin referring to the Eldeen as gods and goddesses as well. As technology continued, they created means of reproduction with their new Emelas bodies, allowing for a new Eldeen to be born, one that would grow up with winged bodies imbued with White Emelas. They also created the Black Pearl, a large spherical mass of Black Emelas. This artifact not only possessed indescribable magic power, but also had the ability to amplify the magic in other objects. There was the Akashic Records, unknown if they were actually created by the Eldeen or merely discovered, but its power shouldn't be understated. They contained the world's blueprints, including the world's structure, properties, and origins. Everything regarding the past and future of the world is contained in these records. While they can be viewed by seemingly anyone, they can only be altered by one in the possession of the Mask of the Sun, a device created by the Eldeen. It's known that the future is not set in stone by the Akashic Records. Likely it only holds the most likely outcomes and maintains a staggering success rate. If the future deviates, the Mask of the Sun can be used to ensure the records are consistent with what is actually happening for record keeping. This was the Mask's true and only purpose by the Eldeen. They also created the Ark of Napishtim, a massive technological marvel on the eastern end of the Atlas continent. The Ark was more like a supercomputer, containing pure Emelas on the interior of numerous black skyscrapers. It served 2 purposes. First, as an archive for information regarding the Eldeen and the likely hold of the Akashic Records, and the second as a means of weather control. Using its incredible Emelas power, it had the ability to control the weather for the entire Atlas Ocean to the east. This was built in order to protect the Atlassian people from the raging storms and waters of the ocean, allowing them to increase oceanic travel abilities and lessen the natural disasters around the coastline. With the kingdom stable and flourishing, the Eldeen decided to share their resources. While they didn't share techniques or technology, other humans were finally given access to Emel. They were able to create red, blue, and gold Emelas easily enough, but they found it increasingly difficult to create the legendary white and black Emelas that the Eldeen were known for. Their attempts to create these forms of Emelas would crumble in the transmutation process, becoming an unofficial 6th form of Emelas. This grayish substance was called Ash Emelas. While Ash Emelas wasn't as magical as other forms, humans found some uses for it. They would experiment infusing Ash Emelas into other living beings. These creatures would become living weaponized monsters, known as Galba. Nevertheless, humans were dissatisfied with their progress and wanted the full power of the white and black Emelas. They believed that the Eldeen were actively trying to withhold information regarding these powerful metals, and while this isn't exactly false, the Eldeen were simply scared of their power falling into the wrong hands. The humans' greed progressed though, and eventually they stole Almarian, the sword-sized key made of black Emelas that was used to control the Arc of Napishtim. A group entered the Ark to try and learn the Eldeen knowledge straight from the source. However, they misused the Ark's power and caused it to go berserk. The weather systems went out of control, and the sea level of the Atlas Ocean skyrocketed, flooding the Atlas continent. The continent, including the Eldeen Kingdom, was quickly overrun by the rushing tides, and only some of the highest peaks of the land survived, including what would become the Canaan Islands that surrounded the Ark. It was clear that this calamity could soon flood the entire planet. Alma, one of the strongest of the Eldeen, made the decision to lay her life on the line to stop the Ark. She led the fight to stop the Galba's forces that were protecting the humans, and made 3 new keys to replace and override the Lost Almarian. They were made of blue, red, and gold Emelas. The Sword of Levart, Brillante, and Erixil. These keys were able to stop the Ark's actions, but not before one final self-defense measure was put in place. The Ark called a great vortex to surround the Canaan Islands, preventing anyone from approaching the land of the Ark. Finally, Alma sacrificed the magic in her body by sublimating and petrifying herself to be the final key, one that will force the Ark underwater, away from misuse, for hopefully eternity. Atlas was no more, and survivors began to disperse. Most Eldeen ascended to the heavens with their mystical wings, while some fled east across the ocean. While most humans uninterested with Emel were killed by the sudden flooding, many of those who sought the power of the Emelas were prepared, and were able to flee on seacraft out east as well. This faction, along with their descendants, became known as the Darklings, or sometimes called the Clan of Darkness. The Reda that survived were forced to retreat to the Canaan Islands, where they became unable to leave thanks to the great vortex that now surrounded the land. They worshipped their goddess Alma, who saved the islands and the rest of the world from the wrath of the Ark of Napishtim. What lie east? The continents of Eresia in the north and Afroka in the south. Eresia was starting to become more populated in the large region of Europa. While almost all Eldeen did indeed leave the earthly plane to ascend to the heavens, a few traveled to Eresia, and with them they brought their technology and knowledge. This included the rarest of Eldeen artifacts, which were saved from flooding but couldn't be taken with the Winged Ones to the heavens. This included the Akashic Records and Mask of the Sun, which were taken by a man named Eldiel, and the Black Pearl, which was taken by the twins Rhea and Fina. Another Eldeen, named Genos, had a different motivation. He witnessed a rogue Galba, one that was more powerful than any seen prior, and one that had actually seemed sentient. Dubbed Galbalan, it fled the remnants of Atlas, of its own free will, and headed east towards Eresia. Genos couldn't let this creature wreak havoc on the rest of the world, and so gave chase, after the mythic beast, towards Eresia. Eldiel went to the region of Selceta, in the Espani Peninsula of Europa. Rhea and Fina went to a small island nation off the European coast called Is, and Genos chased Galbalan to the Fergana region in eastern Garman. Each of these 3 lands became influenced by the coming of the Eldeen, most notably Is, but first let's briefly explore the nearby lands in Europa that suddenly became exposed to the power of the gods. In Selceta, Eldiel made his residence and planted a seed which would become a rhoda tree, an intelligent plant that allowed Eldeen to communicate with the earth itself. Rhoda trees were created by the Eldeen, along with small beasts known as the Ru, who served as residents and caretakers of the rhoda tree. Ru were seen as sacred beasts to those who regarded the Eldeen as legendary gods and goddesses. It's thought that rhoda trees and their caretakers were created by the Winged Ones not just for magic and scholarly purposes, but also a form of camaraderie. Rhoda trees are known to live in years ranging in thousands, which, to an immortal being such as the Eldeen, would seem like a life a bit less fleeting compared to mortal humans, and would likely make for a good source of conversation and companionship. In Selceta, Eldiel would meet an intelligent swordsman by the name of Lafance. Together they founded the Kingdom of Selceta, and thanks to the Akashic Records, the Mask of the Sun, and the Rhoda Tree, the kingdom was prosperous, and its rulers loved. Together they created a dragon soldier by the name of Sol Galba, which would act as a faithful servant to Lephance and his future bloodline. For centuries, the kingdom would prosper under Eldiel and Lephance's descendants. In Felghana, Genos had arrived to slay the mighty Galbalan, who had finally arrived from across the ocean. Genos was able to force the beast to an island slightly offshore from the Felghana mainland. Here the two did battle, with both bringing each other to the brink of death. Genos emerged victorious, but even with his strength he could not completely destroy Galbalan. He was, however, able to seal it under the island where which they fought. The seal could only be broken using Genos' divine power, with which he gave up and transferred into 4 statues. He hid these 4 statues across Felghana, in hopes that this would cause Galbalan to remain trapped for eternity. Genos would live with the people of Felghana, eventually living on the island where he fought Galbalan, which was later renamed to Genos Island. Genos would later choose to ascend to the heavens, but it is said that his descendants live on Genos Island. The Clan of Darkness, or the Darklings, would spread throughout the Arisian continent following their exodus from Atlas. While plenty continued their search and abuse of the power of Emelas, some decided to go into relative hiding and have a fresh start as benevolent magic users who sought to rectify their ancestors' mistakes and establish themselves in villages spread throughout the land. Though those that did seek out power often did so with destructive plans and a dangerous disregard for innocent casualties, this was no more clear than the events that would transpire on the island nation of Ys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the first part of this new Complete Chronologies miniseries, and I hope you look forward to the next episode. Also, a huge shout out to Jessie Brianna Cooper of DigitalEmelas.com. She was a huge help for filling in specific blanks, offering guidance in areas that were a bit confusing, and just being an incredible resource for all things Ys lore related. Digital Emelas as a whole is the largest Ys fan site out there, and they've done an incredible job being a resource of information, leading an awesome community of fans, and overall doing a great job of spreading awareness of this incredible series in the West. I highly encourage checking them out in the description below. Stay tuned to my social media pages on screen if you would like to follow me for updates on my videos, or just in general. Also be sure to check out my first series on Myst if that so interests you and you haven't seen it yet. And make sure to have a good one, whenever and wherever. This is Crimock. See you guys next time.